All right, we're live, guys. Thank you very much for joining us in the live stream today. Thank you, everybody who's in the live chat right now, and thank you to everyone who's going to be watching us later on as well. I appreciate you guys all being here. Today's a great episode because I've had these guys on the show before, and I had a fantastic chat. And by all accounts, you guys enjoyed it as well because I got a lot of positive comments after that podcast. So today we're going to be talking about something that's very relevant to, I think, India, especially after the abrogation of Article 370. We touched on it briefly on our previous conversation, but I think we're going to get into it in a little more concentrated sense on this episode. So before we get into it, help me welcome back to the show Cliff Smith and Sam Westrop from the Middle East Forum. Welcome.
Hey. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, for sure. So we talked about this briefly sort of last time, as in, how in the sort of discussions where it was usually a discussion between, the Palestine issue, the Israel-Palestine issue, in those circles, like Kashmir in the last year or so has become pretty prominent. Mm-hmm. And we've seen that particularly in the West, in the United States, we've seen that a lot, as in groups like CARE, like ICNA, that were usually mostly interested in the Israel-Palestine issue, have been working with some of these pro-Kashmiri, whatever you want to call them, groups, and have been really helping amplify their voices. And what do you think, one of the reasons that's happened, obviously, is because of the Kashmir issue and how fresh it is. Like, it's barely, the decision's barely over a year old. But I think, Sam, a little bit to do with that is also the fact that maybe the Israel-Palestine issue has sort of lost the kind of traction that it used to get maybe in mainstream American politics. Like especially if you look at the overtures that have been made between Israel and some certain Arab countries, and they're working to normalize relations, it doesn't have the kind of traction that it might have had a few years ago, right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much true. And certainly now that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are not pushing anti-Israel rhetoric around the world and funding boycott efforts, the ferocity has lessened. That said, Qatar is still and Turkey is still very much involved in a global effort to delegitimize, to demonize the world's only Jewish state, and so it does continue, but it does seem less so in a way. Both the right are talking less about Israel in terms of defense, the left are talking about Israel less in terms of criticism, and it remains mostly the far left and the Islamists who insist upon bringing it up at the moment. Their focus has switched to other parts of the world, including India, perhaps India most of all. And we live in uncertain times, and this is not just about geopolitics and the changes there. This is also about changes within Islamism and within the far lefts, the way their own politics is changing, and different issues come to the fore and others recede. These are interesting times, and I'm not entirely sure what this means in the long term at the moment. To some extent, Israel will always be despised, certainly by these groups, and they'll always be able to find allies. And I think India is about to experience a bit of what Israel has been through for the last 20 years when it comes to this kind of international demonization.
Yeah, I do agree. And it's, Cliff, we were talking about this offline as well, so I might as well talk about it now, that Kashmir is an issue that's obviously very new in terms of the decision that the government's taken in Kashmir. So there's a lot more potential to be able to exploit it, simply because A, it's fresh, B, people are not as well informed about Kashmir as they like to think they are. A lot of the people that talk about the issues in Kashmir, they're not that well informed about the legal aspects of the Kashmir issue. They're not as well informed about the historical aspects of the Kashmir issue. So I think that sort of misinformation, simply because of how new this issue is, really helps stoke a lot of, helps these organizations exploit the confusion that already exists, right?
Yeah, I think, put simply, for all kinds of historical, economic, even religious reasons, the U.S. has been focused on the Middle East for a long time. And when it came to issues regarding radical Islam, when it came to Israel, when it came to a lot of things, they were just more interested in the Middle East and what was going on there than they were other parts of the world.
Right.
And I joked, I think offline too, that to many Americans, Kashmir is a Led Zeppelin song. They don't, and they may vaguely know that there's some area of India that is under dispute, but they do not understand anything about the history, far past or recent past. And so when you talk to people in Congress or talk to people at think tanks or reporters or any of the kind of decision makers or opinion leaders in the U.S., you're starting from zero or near zero, which is totally unlike Israel-Palestine. Even people that frankly don't know what they're talking about think they do, and they have an opinion on it. What this does is, as we were discussing, the Islamists, the people, the theocrats in the Muslim world, they have been beating the Israel-Palestine drum for decades, if not since the beginning of Israel's creation. They've kind of, to a degree, worn that out. As you pointed out, I mean, it's the worst kept secret in the world that Israel and Saudi Arabia have pretty close relations, even if not officially. UAE just recognized Israel. Essentially, these theocrats are they're losing that battle badly. And something that is much more fresh and where they have a much blanker slate, particularly in the West, is a place like India in the Kashmir dispute, which is why you've seen both internationally and domestically in the West, Islamist groups, Islamist activist groups, and even to terrorist groups, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, so on and so forth, and terrorists in the Middle East, like Hamas, all focused on this. And you see them focused on each other's causes, and you see it becoming one cause, partially because this new dispute in Kashmir sort of gives their dream of Islamic theocracy, of expanding, Dar al-Islam to another place. And that is what they're focused on now.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is similar between like Israel and India and the Kashmir situation in the sense is that even if, let's say, the people who are on the other side of the Kashmir issue, where they're saying that, oh, this is not something that the government should have done, we don't agree with what the government has done, and so forth, so on and so forth. Even if, you could say that, all right, in certain cases, you can see that they could have a point, like just to give an example, recently, the Supreme Court of India passed an order saying that Muharram parades should not be allowed because it's a health risk during the coronavirus. And so the government enforced that because the courts passed it. Well, the government could have just said, we're going to still allow people to do the Muharram thing if they want to do it, just in a very contained space. But they didn't allow it. And then that led to violent protests erupting in Kashmir, and some people got hurt. So people make the case that, oh, look what the government is doing in Kashmir. And look, even if you have a case there, like, hey, just let us do the Muharram thing, but just let us do it in a confined space and nobody will have a problem. The problem is that whenever, these supporters of the other side of the Kashmir issue, whenever they come at the government with these maybe sometimes valid points, they don't want to stay there. We were discussing this offline, Cliff, that it's whenever they talk about these issues, it's all or nothing. When the Palestinian side was talking about the Israel-Palestine issue, it was like one state solution, get the Jews out of there, or nothing. Mm-hmm. And the same thing that we see with all of these radical groups in Kashmir as well, where they're saying, well, we want to maintain the Islamic character of Kashmir, and we do not want so and so and so people in Kashmir, and we do not want so and so and so people to even have their basic rights in Kashmir. Mm-hmm. So even if you had a genuine point against the government, you lose a lot of traction there because you're going with that all or nothing attitude, right?
Well, certainly. I think you lose any real credibility, at least with anybody that cares about anything resembling small L liberalism, a pluralism of, any sort of freedom that you or I would recognize. I work for the Middle East Forum, and Dr. Pipes, the president, has made the point again and again. He just recently did in the pages of the New York Times, actually, that, look, if the Palestinians had really wanted their own state, they could have had it a long time ago. Yeah. As you pointed out, this was not about, oh, we'd like the West Bank and Gaza, and maybe another neighborhood or two to be the Palestinian state. It's we reject any sovereignty for a Jewish state anywhere in this area. Period. And so that, and in the same time, you see Kashmiri activists that are very open about the fact that, look, all we really want is to be part of Pakistan, then we want to make Pakistan even more Islamic.
Yeah.
I mean, they're very open about this. They are not shy. They say it explicitly. And so when you look at the kind of claims they're making when they're talking about freedom, what they really mean is, ethnic rule, total ethnic rule, not that above all else, not even some sort of pluralistic society that with the majority, and they want a theocracy. That's the end of it. That's the truth at the end of it.
But there is one very interesting difference, of course, between Kashmir and Palestine, and that's that most of the infrastructure set up to attack Israel, to support a Palestinian state, or that's a bit generous, it's usually to support Hamas or support but they do agree on something. They want a Palestinian state, and usually that's a one-state solution. Sometimes they believe in two, but at the very least, a Palestinian-run state is at the heart of it.
Right.
What does the support network for Kashmir want? Do they want an independent Kashmiri state? Do they want a greater Pakistan? That's extremely unclear.
Yeah.
And I've noticed when they're asked, they definitely avoid the question. To me, this kind of suggests they're very much bought into the Pakistani agenda here, but that's a whole other discussion. So there are, of course, differences, while there are parallels. The one group that seem convinced of the parallel above all others, even beyond us here, are the Islamists themselves, who, as Cliff has pointed out, have equated these two conflicts as one and the same fight against some sort of greater evil represented by Modi, represented by Netanyahu. It's interesting. It's interesting, and I wonder where it's going to go from here.
And the thing that's most interesting to me is how rapidly it shifted. As I said in a recent article, it was in 2014 that during Israel's Operation Protective Edge in Gaza, Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan held a rally in which they held up a Palestinian flag and wore Hamas uniforms, and they posted it on Facebook saying, "We are all Hamas." That was not that long. It was a few years ago. And then and there were these connections that we pointed out in some of our articles of, for example, Jamaat-e-Islami sending money to Hamas, of all these different other South Asian organizations pledging support for Hamas and the Palestinians. And then almost overnight in 2019, even before Kashmir special status was revoked, but when it became an issue after the Palama attacks, it all flipped. I mean, it wasn't all at once, but it was pretty darn close to where the focus switched to Kashmir in a really big way. And I have no doubt that some of that was organic, but it's always been interesting to me. I wonder what else is going on behind the scenes, that the flip was very hard and very clear in terms of how much the focus changed for a lot of these groups, including ones that traditionally had been much more concerned about the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at like the politicians, like if you look at certain members of the squad like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and we spoke about this on the mostly preoccupied with the sort of Israel-Palestine issue. Whenever they talk about such issues, they talk about the Israel-Palestine issue, but they've been fairly vocal, particularly Ilhan Omar has been fairly vocal on the Kashmir issue over the last year, and that was something that was pretty surprising to see. And I think one of the reasons why that's probably happening also is that if you look at most countries, individual politicians in those countries have maybe spoken up about the Kashmir issue and have made certain statements, but generally speaking, the governments of those countries have been relatively ambivalent or even like indifferent to the issue. They're like, look, it's a democratic country taking a democratic step within their own boundary, whatever. Like that's been the general sort of response to most countries, whether or not individual politicians have, said something or the other. And I feel like that's why these politicians in the United States, Sam, they've felt sort of compelled to speak up. And that's probably also because of the pressure of some of these groups that are behind, propping up these Kashmiri voices as well, right?
Yeah, there's some interesting things at work here. I think that let's look at something that's not said,
Sure.
and that's look at the Squad, look at Ilhan Omar, look at what they say when it relates to, say, China and the treatment of the Uyghurs. Now, the Muslim community spoke out about that a little in passing, but while there's a stand with Kashmir group active across the United States, there isn't a stand with the Uyghurs group. The Islamist scene here in the US has not, and the far left has not set up a whole infrastructure to boycott China and to analyze it, to run events and seminars in the same way they're doing about Kashmir, in the same way they're doing against India. So I think primarily it seems to me that Ilhan Omar and co are reflecting the focus of the Islamist-run Muslim communities in the US. Right. And that's where their obsession currently lies. There are, of course, international politics that complicate things here. Yeah, absolutely. But to me, and maybe I push this agenda because my job, after all, is to follow Islamists and to look at trends. So, of course, I'm going to see Islamism as the core of everything. So, yeah, absolutely, I've got a bias here. I just so happens in this instance, I think I'm probably right. I think this is the far left is tagging along, but this is Islamist driven, and the Squad is representing their interests.
Yeah, it's worth noting. I just find interesting. Ilhan Omar, I'm forgetting exactly who it was that questioned her. But she was questioned by, I believe, a reporter saying that she had never really spoken out in the Uyghur issue. And her press people went crazy and put together something where she had mentioned it, like twice in passing. And look, right. It almost kind of proved the point to me. It was like, okay, well, great. You said, China shouldn't be massacring Muslims. That's nice. You haven't, you didn't, say go to a committee that you're not a member of in order to get a, stem winder, barn burner, blunt instrument attack on Kashmiri Pandit, that suggested the jihadists were part of the problem, like she in the hearing last year on Kashmir. I mean, there's clearly an imbalance here, and there's clearly a reason for it, because it has nothing to do with the lives of Muslims. I mean,
but again, this is a
harsh assessment of what's happened in Kashmir. It's not even 1,000th of what's happened in China. Right. And frankly, everybody looks at it more in 5 seconds. Knows it.
Yeah. And I was about to say what Cliff just said, that it's preposterous to look at. But by the way, it's another good example of the great parallel between what's happening with India and what's happened with Israel. Just as China places its Muslims in concentration camps, and yet the world goes after India for battling jihadists. Yeah. In Israel, as the world attacked Israel for building houses, Assad was murdering 200,000 of his own people, putting Palestinians in camps of their own. The parallels continue, and hypocrisy always lies, it seems to lie at the heart of this international agenda. Yeah. This is only going to get worse. But these parallels are actually fascinating, and not.
How do you mean that it's? How do you mean? Sorry to cut across there, Sam. But how do you mean that it's going to get worse? Like, what makes you think that?
Well, if we just assume that the world will not reconcile the truth with politics of the situation, and we look at how the United Nations and other international institutions demonized Israel for the last 4 or 5 decades, despite the obvious iniquities of its neighbors to the west, to its east, to its south. I presume we're seeing that happening with India now. I presume we're going to continue. We're going to see the world continue to downplay some of China's sins while obsessing over India's actions. We'll see it ignore the horrors and evils of Pakistan, despite the fact it's a leading state sponsor of terrorism. We'll look at the rest of Southeast Asia, Indonesia and Malaysia now showing very worrying signs of extremism and fast Islamist growth. India, like Israel, is a glorious democracy in a sea of despotism. Most of the West, I feel, is not realized quite how precarious. Sure, India's a bit bigger than Israel. Right. I'll give it that, but it's in a precarious position. Absolutely. And we're not realizing that. We're succumbing to the agenda and the narrative of people like Ilhan Omar and other naive pawns of Islamist and far left agendas. Yeah. And we're failing to understand just quite how important India is to the West, to democracy, to liberalism, This is much more interesting than certainly I think we realized even just a year ago. This is much more important.
I would add one thing to that. I basically agree with everything Sam said. What I would add to that is there is, if you're going to give the best possible good faith into some of this, there's simply no good faith. But you can say that in both cases of Israel and India, there is they're pressuring the reasonable party, right? I mean, people understand that it doesn't matter how much you tweet at or scream at or issue statements about Assad or China or Pakistan. Frankly, it's not going to matter a whole lot. It's not going to do anything. While democracies tend to respond to these kinds of things in different ways, which in and of itself is not necessarily wrong. I'm not against holding democracies to higher standards, provided, and this is a very important provided, that you are doing so in a way that actually builds in those democratic aspirations, not tears them down.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a little bit outside of just the Middle East or South Asia or radical Islam space, but I think that there needs to be a reappreciation of moral democratic systems of government, a appreciation of the idea that, look, yes, there are problems inherently. Democracies aren't meant to build utopias. They're meant to stop worse things from happening, and they're shockingly effective at stopping far worse things from happening. And they are, by, as Churchill said, the worst form of government except for all the others that have ever been tried. And we are losing that appreciation, I believe. The West in general is forgetting how much different things look without it, and they're not appreciating the blessings of democracy. And I think in the long run, you need to remember that when you're dealing with these kinds of issues, and people need to remember that a lot more.
Right. I want to quickly take a look at sort of the Indian government's response as well, because I think a little bit of the responsibility has to be shouldered by the Indian government in terms of how it has communicated the Kashmir issue as well. Like if you look how quickly sort of the international, a lot of these organizations and a lot of the media, sort of how quickly it went on the offensive when it came to Kashmir, and how slow the government was to react to it in terms of like its own counter sort of information offensive. Look, this is what the truth is. This is what we've done. What is being reported in the media is not actually what's happened. Since you're based in the United States, Cliff, what kind of a response from like, or I don't know if you've noticed this at all, but have you noticed any kind of like a proper cohesive diplomatic response from India to these allegations?
I'm trying to think of how to respond to that.
Sure.
I certainly have seen, denials that a lot of the crazier accusations are true,
right.
which I think is generally true, and I've certainly seen coordinated defenses from the Indian government and different people, Indian diaspora reporters, such that have tried to give a more realistic narrative. I think the problem, from my perspective anyway, is not so much that they have played defense wrong. It's that in the long run, your best defense is a good offense. And that's what has been lacking in my view. It's one thing to, I can't remember. There was a webinar with some Islamist groups that were saying that recently, I'm trying to remember which one, I can't right off the top of my head, but they were saying something completely insane, like 50,000 people have been murdered in Kashmir over the past 6 months or something. I mean, just totally bonkers, crazy stuff that clearly hadn't happened. But as long as you're kind of saying, well, that's not true. Well, okay, maybe it's not. But, there probably has been, some innocent children caught in the crosshairs. And and the Islamists make sure that is all across social media and everywhere.
Yeah.
There probably have been some individual soldiers that have done some bad things or made some questionable judgments. And so if you're only playing defense, it's only the misses. It's only the problems that are ever going to get a focus.
Yeah.
What there needs to be, in my view, is both on the part of the Indian government and Indian diaspora, and basically anybody that favors freedom, democracy, and opposes theocracy, is going back at their opponents and saying, hey, look, you're saying that it sucks that this child got caught in the crossfires and now had to have their leg amputated or something. That's horrible. You know, let's talk about what Hizbul Mujahideen has done. Well, let's talk about the kinds of things Jamaat-e-Islami has enabled. Let's talk about what Lashkar-e-Taiba really believes. Let's talk about what their enablers in the West really, believe. As pointed out, or Sam pointed out too, there's not a clear answer to what they actually want. They just don't want India. Okay, you want Pakistan? Let's talk about Pakistan and how things go there.
Yeah.
As a Heritage Foundation study pointed out recently, the Kashmiri Indian Muslims, under the harshest part of the lockdown after the abrogation of 370, have more civil rights and civil liberties than Pakistani Muslims do every day.
Yeah.
Make those kinds of points and make them a lot more loudly, and start asking these people, what do you actually favor? How do you favor civil rights? How do you favor freedom? What about the rights of women? What about the rights of religious minorities? Stick the fight back to them. That is something I have seen, at least from my perspective, only on a very limited basis.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be much more extensive.
Yeah, it's also, again, it's obviously a situation where India can learn from Israel, because back in the 1980s, when the international campaign against Israel really took off, it was back then they started talking about the need to respond through PR, through various initiatives, and they didn't do it very seriously at first, and people warned them this is going to go badly for you, and it did go badly for them. The boycott movement was born. Governments around the world were once friendly to Israel started to turn against it, especially at international fora like the United Nations. But Israel did eventually wake up, and I think I'm not the expert in this, but there were two lessons that I'm somewhat aware they learned. Firstly, there's a very limited use to the language of good news. The temptation in the beginning was to publish lots of photos of Israelis and Palestinians getting along and playing in a school, cooking falafel together, that kind of thing. There's a limited value to that kind of stuff, even if it's true. Limited value. You still, but by not responding to the lies and the propaganda and the attacks directly, you're allowing those to flourish, while your good news looks like propaganda of its own. Israel sort of started to really defend itself when it set up dedicated social media units within the army, within the government, when it went on the attack, when it published information about the terrorist groups in far greater detail than any other government around the world has done. India should do the same. How many people, take out a room of 100 Americans, how many have heard of Jaish-e-Mohammed? How many have heard of Lashkar-e-Taiba? I'm betting, unless there's an Indian in that room, I'm betting none of them have heard those names. And these should be these names should be as well known as Hamas. Certainly these groups kill probably a lot more people than Hamas does in terms of sheer numbers. That's what the Indian government needs to do. Huge campaigns to educate the world on the evils that it's facing and why the defense of India is the defense of the West.
One thing I'd like to point out that this is a little detail that I found interesting and kind of frustrating. There is a book written by a Pakistani named Arif Jamal called Shadow War. It's about Kashmir. And Arif Jamal is a straight-up truth teller. He's not a Pakistani partisan, but he is ethnically Pakistani. He, was born there, all that. And he points out something in his book that that basically Jamaat-e-Islami, for all practical purposes, founded Hizbul Mujahideen, and he discusses how that was done. You point that out to your average Pakistani, or frankly, even your average Indian, Bangladeshi, or even American that discusses these issues, and no, that's different. Jamaat and Hizbul, they're totally different. Like, to what degree? To what really? I mean, it's like there may be some sort of small cleavage there.
Yeah.
But, they don't get talked about in the same way terrorist groups and their Islamist partners do in the Middle East. These connections and obvious connections, don't get pointed out. So, in other words, when ICNA, for example, the demonstrable fact by any reasonable measure that they are a Jamaat-e-Islami front group.
Hey, Cliff, just explain what ICNA is quickly.
Yes, I'm sorry. Islamic Circle of North America is a Jamaat, the face of Jamaat in the U.S. This is not just right-wing sources talking. Vali Nasser, the professor at Johns Hopkins, who has actually been on TV a lot trashing the Trump administration's Iran policy, in his book on Jamaat-e-Islami says that ICNA, or Islamic Circle of North America, is one of the 8 most important branches of Jamaat in the entire world. It's very overt. They're not secret about it. But when people say, "Oh, these guys are fronts for Jamaat-e-Islami," nobody really gets it.
Yeah.
You tell someone else, "Oh, this is a Hamas front group." Well, that they understand. And there needs to be more pointing out things like that.
Yeah. That's one of the things that we spoke about on the last podcast, about how some of these groups, even under Trump, they enjoy like political patronage and funding. How does that, come to pass? Because the connections that a group like ICNA have to an organization like Jamaat-e-Islami are fairly clear. And I'm sure like people within the government are probably aware of those connections. So despite having those connections, how do you think, Sam, I don't know if you or Cliff want to answer this one, but how do you think that funding still goes to them? Like, what's the reason that they're still able to collect funding from the government despite those clear connections?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And it's also useful to contrast Europe and the US on this issue, because over the last 10 years, a number of very prominent Islamist charities have seen their funding from European governments decimated, cut considerably. And that's accompanied a greater understanding of these charities' ties to extremism, how they fit into these international networks of radicalization and terror finance. Two really good examples, Islamic Relief, huge British Muslim Brotherhood charity, and also Muslim Aid, huge British Jamaat-e-Islami charity. Both of these have been are under investigation, have been under investigation by various European countries because of these allegations of ties to terrorism, and also accusations of just extremism in general.
Right.
The US, they have both received considerable funding from the United States government without any sort of questions by pretty much by the federal government about their ties and about their things, and it really does come down just to ignorance. The US is less familiar with these charities. It hasn't been working with them. They haven't had to deal with them for as long a time. And fundamentally, these charities perform a service for government. They are part of the international development operations of Western governments. International aid has always subcontracted its dealings. It's always delegated to charities. And these international Islamist charities, despite their links to known extremist networks, do charity. They do that. It does happen. Right. They do house the homeless. They do feed the hungry. It just so happens they also subsidize and logistically support terrorism. And this is why they get away with it, because they mix those two things so well. The US government has yet to wake up to this. About, in 2000 and from 2002, 2008, the Bush administration did understand this, and they went after these charities hard. And in fact, even various Obama administration officials have understood this at times. Eleanor Kagan, when she was a government prosecutor, famously said, when you help Hezbollah build homes, you're helping Hezbollah build bombs. Right. Well, right now, US taxpayers' money is helping Lashkar-e-Taiba, is helping Jaish-e-Mohammed through the social and welfare networks in Kashmir and India that Western Islamist charities are subsidizing and funding and getting federal dollars to do that. The European governments are beginning to understand that. The American government, especially this administration, is not. As I think we mentioned last time on the show, funding to Islamist groups has actually gone up under Trump. It's more under Trump than it was under Obama, which is bizarre if you go by the sort of the reputation that Trump has and his supposed arms against radical Islam and so on. The groups like Muslim Aid, which I mentioned, continue to be on the government's list of approved contractors. Islamic Relief got several $100,000 just in October. This is not an administration that is clued up to this danger, and whoever wins in November, I'm a bit worried they're going to continue this legacy of stupidity.
Certainly, and let me stick with you for a second as well, Sam. You said that countries in Europe or governments in Europe are a little more wise to this than the U.S. government. What do you think that the European governments did differently, or what made the European governments realize this sooner?
So it's 20, 30 years of dealing with domestic terrorism. Okay. Government said, hey, are terrorists just born like that, or is there a slow process of radicalization? And there's obviously a slow process of radicalization. Communities are taken over by Islamists. That means that non-violent Islamists, people who run the mosques and run the community groups and the charities, including networks like Jamaat-e-Islami, they play a role in radicalization. Even though they're mostly non-violent in the West, they play a role because they create a worldview. They indoctrinate a whole generation of Muslim youth with this worldview in which violence is justified or can be justified, in which certainly violence emerges. So charities, government quickly realized, were a key part of this. They saw that these charities, yes, they were raising money to feed the hungry in Yemen, but they were using it by bringing clerics to address fundraising events, clerics who called for the killing of Jews, the killing of Shia Muslims, the killing of Hindus. The government quickly realized charities were very much part of the problem, and they started to scale back the amount of money that were going into the pockets. That was combined with an awakening on behalf of the media, and I'm very scornful of American media. But the European media, to its great credit, does something American media seems just unable to do, which is separate news from the editorial side. So if you take a newspaper like The Guardian, very left-wing, far to the left editorially of the New York Times, their editorial may say, yeah, Hamas isn't so bad, but their news team will still expose Hamas networks. They'll still write, a designated terrorist group is running this charity and it's a registered charity in the United Kingdom. What is the government going to do about it? Can't get to do that in the US. The New York Times wouldn't touch that story. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, the Times of London ran a series of articles on Islamic Relief, the largest Muslim charity in the world, showing that its officials had a long history of support for terrorists, of support for anti-Semitism. As a result of the Times reporting, the government has now launched an investigation. The Charity Commission, the regulator of charities, has launched an inquiry. The entire board of Islamic Relief, this radical Islamist charity, felt compelled to resign, admittedly to replace themselves with equally problematic trustees, but it was a big symbolic move. This would not happen in the United States. No mainstream cable show, no big newspaper like the New York Times, even the Wall Street Journal, would dedicate an entire series of events to investigate a particular Islamist charity. They would have done 15, 16 years ago, just after 9/11. They won't now. And because of this, the Islamists flourish. They continue to operate with complete impunity. A fundamental change in the mindset of the media, as well as government, needs to happen in this country if we're to tackle this stuff. And it is of great distress to me that so much is happening right now in the Islamist world, and the strength of radical forces within American Islam are growing so strongly. And the media not only won't touch it for whatever political reasons, they're not interested in this at all, even in terms of topical focus. So
they almost encourage it too, right? Like if you look at how has somebody like a Linda Sarsour how did somebody like that get on the Women's March for stay on the Women's March for such a long time? How did somebody like Zahra Billu get and stay on the Women's March for such a long time? And she has and Women's March is not some obscure organization. This is a mainstream liberal organization in the United States that enjoys a massive amount of support, obviously from politicians, from civil society, from celebrities, you name it. And you have people like Linda Sarsour and Zahra Billu who were on the Women's March for a while. So, Cliff, in terms of understanding among civil society, among government officials, departments, of the danger, at least the polemic danger that some of these charity organizations pose to democratic values, to liberal values, is there how much of that cognizance is there within government and within government departments, within civil society, or is it just that people don't want to speak up?
Let me take a step back.
Sure.
I basically agree with what you're saying here. I think to a degree, and this is part of a much bigger conversation that is perhaps beyond the scope of our talk here, but you said, those governments don't get this, neither does media get this. Those things are intertwined.
Yeah.
And it's not just because, it's not that the sources of information aren't out there. I mean, if you're intellectually curious, everything me and Sam have talked about is out there. A lot of it comes from us, a lot of it doesn't too. I mean, there's a lot of good people that have discussed this topic in different places of the world. I mean, certainly it's not that hard to find a lot of this information if you really want to. But the government is increasingly, this is personal opinion, but I think the last two administrations have been driven to an unusual degree by the media. And so the media sort of dropping the ball on this leads to the government dropping the ball on this. It's a vicious cycle downward. In terms of, Linda Sarsour and her ilk, that comes into them, the Islamists being successful in painting any concern about anti-Semitism or radicalism as being inherently Islamophobic. And I think that the media being willing to buy into that narrative and simply not look beyond, that simple charge leads to them ignoring it, which leads to government ignoring it, which leads to, which leads to the media ignoring it more. It just goes downward. It becomes political even more, and everybody gets a vested interest in not seeing the obvious until, as in the case, at least in Europe with this IR board, which admittedly is a little different, but until it gets to the point where they can't ignore it anymore, and then something happens, when the Sarsour gets kicked off the board, whatever.
Yeah.
Once it gets really, really bad, but then just people kind of forget about it because they don't want to admit they made a mistake. They don't want to admit there's an issue. The narrative still controls.
Yeah, it is. And could you talk a little bit about, just to give people a little bit of a refresher about how some of these organizations like an ICNA, like a CARE, like I think another one was HHRD, right? That was another one. Like these were all like organizations that have been traditionally talking about Israel. Could you give us an overview about how and with the use of what organizations have they sort of focused their attention onto Kashmir now?
So you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So the transfer to Kashmir has been pretty wholesale.
Okay.
Obviously, groups like ICNA and other groups associated with the South Asian Islamist movements have always tried to make Kashmir an issue. But it's only in the last 2 years that the rest of the Islamist movement has followed suit. So we now have this situation. Let me give you a very broad overview of the Islamist gamut in the United States. This is broad, and I'm going to skip quite a few groups. But briefly, I always claim there are 6 or 7 big networks operating in the US when it comes to Islamism. First, our old friends Jamaat-e-Islami, huge. It's misunderstood. It's completely underestimated how influential they are, but very big network. Not many mosques under their control. They mostly operate through community centers, through political initiatives, through charity and community groups. Then you have the Muslim Brotherhood. They're the sort of the original Islamists in the United Kingdom. They set up a lot of mosques and the original community groups like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Organizations, and ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, which ran an event with Imran Khan last year. Those are the big main 2 sort of activist organizations. Then you have the clerical Islamists, who are the Salafis, so mostly Middle Eastern influence, but they also made a great deal of inroad into the African American communities. There are lots of black Salafi as well. Then you have the Deobandis, another South Asian clerical movement. I'm not going to go into them, but there is, actually, I should say one thing. There's increasing evidence that they're raising money in Deobandi mosques these days for Jaish Mohammed, and we've come across a few examples of that.
Wow.
Keep an eye on our research, because this is something we plan to write about soon. Then there's the Shia Islamist scene, and that's those groups affiliated with the Iranian regime, with Hezbollah as well. And then you have foreign state sponsors, things like the Qatari regime. They have their own network active in the US, Turkish regime, and so on. Now, there are about 4 or 5 dozen others I can mention, but they're much smaller, and I won't. The point about mentioning all of those is that every single one of those networks is now talking about Kashmir. All of those ones I mentioned. The Qatari is through Al Jazeera, are going after India. The Turks, through charities and through events, are going after India. The Deobandi clerics are getting involved with Stand with Kashmir. Jamaat-e-Islami is running the Stand with Kashmir campaign. Muslim Brotherhood is running webinars. It's sponsoring resolutions. Just in Washington earlier this week, a former CARE official used a city council resolution to denounce another Hindu member simply because of her links to India. This is going on everywhere. The Salafis, especially the sort of more modernist strain of them, are also getting involved in all these political activism events about Kashmir. They didn't even really get involved much with Israel stuff, and now you're seeing them getting involved with anti-Indian, pro-Kashmiri stuff. This is a huge switch in focus for the American Islamist community, and very few things very few things unite the American Islamist community. They spend more time fighting each other than they do the outside world. There are a few things, the Muslim ban, for example, Trump, right, exactly. But even on Israel, they can't really agree. On India and Kashmir, they're increasingly speaking with one voice. This is, and I think this is why Cliff and I are being so vocal about this, that we think this is just the start. We think this is going to get really problematic.
Right. And more specific, I'm actually have a draft of an article that I have not yet published, looking into some specific examples of some of this. But I mean, it really is funny how this is, gotten into domestic politics. I mean, the BDS campaign, which is specifically focused on Israel, and in fact criticized for holding Israel to a unique standard holds in no other country. Find one other country it dislikes almost as much, and that's India. And they were making claims such as the weapons that Israel field tested on Palestinian bodies are today being deployed in Kashmir. I mean, it's just really over the top stuff like this. American Muslims for Palestine, right after the abrogation of 370, said that India was adopting a Zionist settler colonialist model. And they were for people to stand with Kashmir. This group we've talked about before, Stand with Kashmir, for its part, started sharing American Muslims for Palestine articles on Kashmir. It just goes around and around in a circle. Islamic Circle of North America, you might expect, given that, as we discussed earlier, or Jamaat-e-Islami franchise, they're animated about Kashmir, but they weren't alone. When they started planting protests, American Muslim Society and CARE, more Muslim Brotherhood-linked groups, joined them right away. And again, you just on and on and on.
And one thing that I always like to point out, and is entirely imposed upon your show without your permission, is that the Indian community is missing a trick here.
I agree.
They should be setting up research institutions, campaigns, new organizations to look at this stuff, to fight it, whether in collaboration with us or independently. This is a huge deal. And there is an entire, this is not just a bunch of activists in their mother's basement. These are powerful organizations with decades of experience in lobbying in Washington, backed by Pakistan, backed by Qatar, backed by Turkey, with millions and millions of dollars at their disposal, far more than any counter effort has to spend themselves. The Hindu community needs to set up the infrastructure to combat this. They must do that, and that's sorely missing. The Jewish community did it far too late. But once they finally got around,
do you think so? Because I feel like at least now the Jewish community has been able to at least create a situation where you can't just use I'm just criticizing Zionism to push your anti-Semitic nonsense in America anymore. At least there's a cognizance within the American people and American politicians as well, is that anti-Semitic hatred is a very real thing, and a lot of these organizations under the garb of trying to criticize Israel are just pushing deeply anti-Semitic hatred. At least I feel like at this point there's that cognizance in America.
I would dispute that.
Really?
Well, there's two things here. One, just the idea that the Jewish community responded too late. By that, I should clarify, I'm talking about, Hamas was setting up boycott operations back in the 90s. Sure. It took the Jewish community 20 years to properly kind of create the infrastructure to respond to this. They're still not doing it very effectively. In terms of anti-Semitism now somehow being too taboo, I just don't think that's true. I think you're right that it's true in certain circles, certain political circles. Ilhan Omar gets huge media attention and criticism when she speaks out. That's a sign that the system's working. She was being held to account, even if she repeats it a few months later and gets away. But at least there was an uproar. That's only happening in some situations. Let me very quickly tell you about a town in Illinois, Champaign, Illinois. The mayor appointed a South Asian Islamist activist, actually, who's involved with the Muslim American Society, close to the Muslim Brotherhood. She appointed this person to the town's Equality Racial Harmony Council. I can't remember what it was called. Some commission to deal with equality and to fight racism. We caught this guy openly calling for the killing of Jews. We caught him reciting a genocidal hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, about finding a Jew wherever he is and killing him.
Right.
This guy has just been made an anti-racism. So we thought, I'll speak to the mayor. I'm sure she'll just be just as shocked as we were to find this out. Of course, mayor's office won't speak to me. So I go to the local newspaper.
Wow.
The local newspaper attacks us as trying to spread disinformation and lies, refuses to check the facts, and attacks us. And we go to the local Jewish community. They say, we don't really want to touch this because, we've got good relations with the mayor's office.
Wow.
No one, including the local Jewish community, wanted to stand up to someone, not just saying, Jews have big noses, someone who was saying, kill the Jews.
Right.
The left-wing government wouldn't do it. The left-wing media wouldn't do it. The local Jewish community wouldn't do it. I spoke to media all across Illinois trying to get one of them interested. And it is interesting, right? When a big town with taxpayers' money appoints a man who calls for the killing of a minority, you'd have thought someone would run that. But no.
Yeah.
So, maybe this is an isolated example. I've come across similar recently. My worry is that it's not being taken seriously.
In a more macro sense, I guess maybe I'm moderate on this particular question. I see both. I think both have some truth to it. But I think we need to look at it in a macro sense. Always, anti-Semitism has always been a thing. Criticism of Israel, unfair criticism of Israel, has always been a thing. But up through the 90s, I think you can make a pretty good case that it was an open question as to which party was more friendly to Israel. I think you can make a very good case that you have very aggressive Israel advocates in positions of power in both parties, and you had perhaps some skeptics on both parties. I mean, even within Ronald Reagan's administration in the 80s, for example, you had George Shultz was seen as being the Secretary of State was seen as being very pro-Israel. Cap Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, was pretty openly more sympathetic to the Arabs. Now, the thrust of his administration was still very pro-Israel, but there were these cleavages. And in the Democratic Party, you had similar things. I mean, we can debate Oslo and everything that all day long. The Clinton administration did this, and when Arafat sort of bailed on Oslo right as Clinton left office, I mean, Bill Clinton has never stopped spitting nails at Yasser Arafat ever. He still does it to this day. So it was an open question. In the last 20 years, I don't think that's really an open question anymore. I could name the amount of people I would deem as serious pro-Israel, politicians in the Democratic Party on my fingers, easily. Right. And none of them, frankly, are in positions of power. And even the ones that were tend to downplay it because the squad types and the far left, and this was, they have disproportionate control. Now, you can argue, I suppose, that this was an artifact of Barack Obama's unique background and the people he brought in. That might be true, maybe, but I don't think so. I really think that just was an accelerant more than a cause. But either way, it is what it is now, where you have one party that is pro-Israel and the other one that is not. In the long term, that is a disaster. Once this becomes a partisan issue, it's going to be much harder. The more partisan it becomes, the harder it becomes for the Israel-America alliance. And frankly, it will become the same way for India if it's allowed to continue to press it.
Yeah, and final couple of things. When it comes to this election as well, like you were talking about, Cliff, the sort of influence that the squad has now within the Democratic Party. When Biden speaks about Israel, he always talks about how Israel's a key ally and, we have Israel's best interests at heart. But then when he picks somebody like Kamala Harris, who claims to be an extremely progressive politician, believes in progressive policies, and she's been welcomed by most of the squad as well. And you have the squad, and there's members within the squad that are quite, strongly anti-Israel politicians. There was that infamous example of Rashida Tlaib. She was promoting Linda Sarsour's book, and she was wearing a T-shirt that the whole T-shirt was just Palestine. There was no Israel in that T-shirt, and it kind of looked like a very pointed message. And so when you have politicians like that, a politician like a Kamala Harris, who's most likely going to be calling the shots in the future, looks to have a lot of looks to look to support them. What do you see happening? If let's say the Democrats win in 2020, do you see their attitude towards like Israel changing significantly? Because if it does, then you can pretty much bet your bottom dollar that their attitude towards India would change quite significantly.
Yeah, I, to be totally honest, I don't have a firm grasp on that.
Sure.
And the reason I'm saying that is because this is a very unusual situation that happened. And frankly, Joe Biden is a somewhat mercurial politician. And that's ironic given how long he's been around. He's been around for longer than I've been alive, by quite a few years. Nonetheless, he's consistently been, I would say, in the leftmost half of the Democratic Party. So I don't think he's a moderate by any, by a normal definition. At the same time, his record on Israel-related issues prior to joining the Obama administration as vice president was not, some sort of super Israel champion, but it wasn't hostile,
right?
At least based on everything I can remember. But the Obama administration, as you know, was much more hostile. At the same time, they told themselves, well, look, we gave them a whole bunch of military aid. We kind of undercut them diplomatically 100 different ways, but we gave them lots of military aid. So they at least had this sort of story they told themselves about being pro-Israel. And what's even more is that Biden won the nomination. I still don't know how to describe it. I mean, he essentially won by accident, best I can tell. I mean, he
well, I think what happened basically is that for like 2 weeks, Bernie Sanders was like the front runner, and the entire Democratic Party had like a collective meltdown. They're like, oh no.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody rallied behind Biden.
And they got behind Biden basically because they realized that, Warren was kind of a dingbat too. They realized Bloomberg they didn't really like and had a whole series of problems. So they went to a guy that they knew and liked, and they went with Biden. But he got there, so essentially owing nothing to anybody. He just kind of coasted in there. So he can write his own future, really. Given his history, as I said, in my view, he has been something of a left-leaning windsock. I mean, he has been in the leftmost half of the Democratic Party, which puts him in the leftmost, 25% of America. I would probably say leftmost 10 or 15%. I mean, I do not think he's a moderate. But at the same time, it's not clear to me where he ultimately comes down. Now, you're saying, him picking Harris is a bad sign. I agree. I think he could have done someone that was much more moderate, that did not have her kind of tendencies, that would have been much more reassuring. Yeah. And I expect that he will probably moderate where the Obama administration was on some of these ways a little bit, but not necessarily a lot. And I think the trajectory will remain unchanged, even if maybe the won't accelerate. That would be my guess, but it's hard to say. I think the lesson for India here is try not to let it get to the point where it's as polarized as Israel now is, because and a very good book is Michael Oren's book, Ally, which was about his time as ambassador here. And according to him, he spent a ton of his time as ambassador, both domestically, talking to Jewish groups and Israeli expats, and trying to tell people back home that, this is not your father's Democratic Party. This is not Harry Truman. This is not even Bill Clinton. This is very different. Yeah. And you need to adjust accordingly, because unless you have some sort of seismic change, which I don't see happening, regardless of the severity of it, the trajectory shows no sign of changing at this point.
Yeah, that's correct. And, Sam, I just want to expand on what you were saying earlier as well about what can India and maybe Indians in the United States can do to fight this sort of misinformation campaign. Let's tackle maybe the Indians in India and the Indian diaspora in India. On their end, like, what would you recommend that the Indian diaspora do, or Indian civil society, if it exists in the United States? What do they need to do to be able to sort of present their side of the their side of the story and be able to maybe influence politics a little more on this?
Yeah. So my suggestion, as I mentioned earlier, although I was talking about India, the States in this case, but in terms of the diaspora as well, don't over focus on good news. Don't show the lovely side of India, lovely though it may be. Don't obsess over that, because that allows the lies and the propaganda, the agitprop to flourish. Hindu groups, Sikh groups, all sorts of Indian community groups should be collaborate. Anyone with a shared interest in defending against the onslaught, the clear, powerful onslaught against India. Set up research groups, set up activism groups, hire law firms, hire PR firms, go on the offensive, go after these networks, go after these groups, go after them in court, go after them in the media, go after them in Congress and in the state legislatures, make sure they're not getting federal monies, make sure the media is investigating their extremist roots, produce the research to make this possible for everyone else, and selfishly work with us to do all this.
Right.
This does need to be done. It's as the Jewish community knows all too well. This is the only thing really you can do. This is an intelligence war, really. And as I mentioned before, the Jewish community was a little slow in realizing that, and they still are. The Hindu community can preempt a lot of trouble by preparing now and getting ready now. At the very least, understanding Pakistan's role in all of this here in the US, that would be pivotal. And certainly, I'm sure the Indian government would have an interest in supporting and collaborating with any effort here to do this kind of thing, to uncover the extent and the enormity of the threat. This is certainly part of our focus for the next few years. So the more allies we see in the Indian diaspora, the better.
And Cliff, on the governmental side, like what kind of a response have you seen from the Indian government in being able to tackle this lobby? And what would you say would be something that the government would need to do?
I'm not a diplomat.
Sure.
I don't know how to gauge all that, and all the things they have to balance. I have seen certainly some effort to push back, but.
Do you think? Okay, let me rephrase that. Maybe. Do you think that there's, in terms of the response that you may have seen diplomatically from like a country like Israel, is there lessons there for India to follow?
Yeah, I think Israel is far more aggressive at calling these people out as a government and saying sort of what's going on, and telling the story not of themselves, which is fine, as Sam put. Sure. It's fine to talk about, how great Israeli falafel or Indian chicken vindaloo is. It's better to point out, hey, that guy that is attacking me is, a Hizbul Mujahideen sympathizer. These people represent Hamas. I don't think there has been sort of a concerted effort to do that. At the very least, it does not seem to me it has been a high enough priority, because in the long run, if they are the only ones telling if they're telling their story about you and you are not telling their story about them, then only one side ultimately gets heard. The fact that you say nice things about yourself doesn't matter much.
And the other thing, again, I'm imposing upon your stream here, upon your viewers, but grassroots, crowdsourcing this work, as Cliff said, just as an example, we came across a poster last week, a bunch of Texas activists, anti-Indian activists, and a couple of local state politicians doing a big webinar with someone we worked out was the sibling of a known terrorist in Kashmir. So this is basically Americans and Kashmiri activists collaborating with a terrorist family. Wow. We came across this by accident. Imagine how much we're missing. We're not. And your viewers, your listeners, you can help with this. Hopefully the Hindu community will set up its own institutions to do this, but you can help this. You'll come across this on social media, in newsletters. Sign up to local anti-Indian groups, local Kashmiri groups, local Islamist groups. Find out what they're doing on Kashmir. And when you come across events, when you come across information, write about it yourself or send it to us. This kind of stuff, we can only cover a minuscule part of it because we're limited by the number of people we employ to research this stuff.
Right.
Through crowdsourcing, through your help, we can do a huge amount. So send us information if you come across it.
Absolutely, I think that's a great way to put it as well, guys. Because I think the diaspora does need to take a little bit of responsibility. I think the government needs to take more responsibility on this. Like sometimes I feel like the Indian diaspora in India and Indian sort of communities in the United States tends to think that things will balance out, and that doesn't always happen. As we've seen, like the Jewish community in America had to step up and do something. The Israeli state had to step up and go on their own information offensive, and that's something that the Indian diaspora and the Indian government needs to do as well. And I think this is a good place to kind of get an idea of where we're at the moment. I think as we get closer to the elections, it'll probably be good to do another one of these episodes to see where we're at that point. But I just want to say again, guys, thanks a lot for coming on today and for offering the information that you did and some of the suggestions as well. I think this was pretty useful, as I can tell from the live chat as well. So thanks, Cliff, and thanks, Sam, for coming on today.
Thank you so much. It's been delightful.
And one more thing, guys, if anybody who's watching, the link to the Middle East Forum is in the description. The link to follow Cliff and Sam is in the description as well. Like he said, I think some coordination and working together on these issues on the grassroots, as Sam said, would be something that's going to be very important going forward. So make sure to go follow them and make sure to go follow their work. Once again, guys, thank you very much for watching today's episode. Sam and Cliff, just stick around offline for a second as well. Sure. But thanks again for watching, guys. If you like it, if you have any suggestions, if you have any questions, let us know in the comments. And whenever we do our chat next, we will try and address those for you. Other than that, stay happy, stay healthy, and we will see you guys next time.